The unexpected war. He walked into the savage alien Matriarchs' territory and left them speechless. The desert winds howled like angry spirits across the dead plains of HFY. The planet was dry, cracked, and cursed by war. No human dared step foot on that land anymore, not after the Matriarchs claimed it. The Matriarchs weren't just any aliens. They were tall, brutal, and born to lead. Their entire society was built by powerful warrior females. Males of their species were kept as servants, or worse. When humans first came to HFY for trade, things went bad quickly. Very bad. The Matriarchs saw humans as weak, soft, and not worth respecting. Talks failed. Then the attacks began. But one man didn't run. His name was Jack Thorne. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He had left that life years ago. But when the last outpost sent a broken distress signal, one filled with screams and static, Jack packed his gear and left alone. The others said it was suicide. "Don't be a fool, Jack," the commander warned. "You can't talk to monsters." But Jack just gave a small smile and said, "Then I'll listen first." No one heard from him after that. He landed his small craft on the edge of the red zone, the last area held by the Matriarchs. A sandstorm rose behind him like a living wall. His ship would be buried in hours. Still, he walked. The ground trembled as giant beasts moved in the distance. Smoke curled from wrecked buildings. Weapons from both sides still littered the sand, half buried in time. Jack stepped carefully, not as a threat, but not as prey either. His every movement showed calm and purpose. Then he saw her. A scout. 7 feet tall, red-skinned, and wearing armor that shimmered with heat. She had scars across her arms, proof of many kills. Her eyes locked onto Jack. She snarled. He stopped. She raised her weapon. Jack raised. Nothing. No gun, no shield, just a hand, open and still. That moment felt like it lasted forever. The wind stopped. The air itself seemed to wait. The scout didn't fire. She studied him, confused, suspicious. Jack spoke. His voice was steady. "I'm not here to fight. I came because no one else would." That only made her angrier. She shouted in her language, rough and sharp like metal on rock. Jack didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. "Why are you here, human? You think we'll spare you?" He didn't move. "I know your kind doesn't trust humans, but I'm not here to change your world. I'm here to see it, to understand." She stepped closer, her weapon still aimed, her breath hot like fire. Then, another figure appeared. This one was even taller, older. She wore a long bone-white cloak. Her eyes glowed blue. She was no scout. She was a leader. Jack knew it without being told. The scout stepped back immediately and knelt. Jack didn't kneel. The matriarch queen studied him like a strange animal. Her voice was calm, but full of power. "Why does a male walk here alone?" Jack took a breath. "Because wars are started by fear, and fear grows in silence. I came to break the silence." She raised a hand, and the scout lowered her weapon. But the queen didn't smile. "And what if we silence you, human?" Jack looked into her eyes. "Then at least you'll know someone tried." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the queen turned and walked away. The scout looked back at Jack, stunned. Then, without a word, she gestured for him to follow. Jack had entered the heart of enemy territory without firing a shot. He had no backup, no escape. But now, he was being led deeper into their world. Behind them, the storm swallowed the horizon. And somewhere inside the matriarch city, something stirred. Something ancient. Something angry. Inside the matriarch's walls, he walked into the savage alien matriarch's territory and left them speechless. The gates of the matriarch city were not made of stone or steel, but of bone. Giant bones, curved and blackened by fire, formed the archways. Jack walked beneath them, the scout at his side, her weapon still hanging loose but ready. The sounds of the city were strange. There was no laughter, no music, just the low hum of machines and the heavy footsteps of warriors. Every face that turned to look at Jack wore the same expression: disgust and confusion. He was a male, a human male. And still, he walked like he didn't care what they thought. The scout didn't speak to him again. She led him through narrow paths and across wide bridges where the ground glowed with heat. Above them, towers shaped like claws reached for the sky. Below, massive beasts roared inside iron cages. Jack had never seen a place like this. It was raw, wild, alive. When they reached the central fortress, more guards appeared, taller than the scout, with armor that shimmered like burning gold. They looked at Jack like they wanted to crush him into the ground. But they didn't move. The queen had given her order. Inside, the walls were covered with carvings, stories of war, of females leading armies, of males kneeling in chains. Jack paused for a second, reading one carving closely. It showed a human, not dead, not captured, but shaking hands with a matriarch. But the face of the human had been scratched out. The scout noticed him staring. She growled low. "That one betrayed us," she said in broken English. "Promised peace. Lied." Jack looked at her. "Then I'm not the first." She didn't answer. At last, they'd reached a great chamber lit by fire. The queen sat on a throne of twisted metal and bones. She didn't wear a crown, but she didn't need one. Her presence filled the room. Behind her, another matriarch stood, a younger one, with silver markings on her skin and sharp eyes full of suspicion. She stared at Jack like he was a dangerous animal. The queen spoke first. "You are brave, human, or foolish. We haven't decided yet." Jack gave a small nod. "Maybe both, but I came for truth." The younger matriarch scoffed. "Truth? Is that what your kind called it when you poisoned our crops and stole our sons?" Jack's eyes narrowed. "I never did those things. And those who did should answer for it." The room went silent. No one expected him to speak like that. The queen leaned forward. "You speak with no fear." "I've seen what fear does," Jack replied. "It burns homes. It ends children's lives. I'm tired of fear." The younger matriarch stepped down from behind the throne and walked slowly around Jack. She circled him like a predator. "I should test your courage right now," she hissed. Jack turned his head slightly, meeting her eyes. "Then do it." The queen raised her hand. "Enough, Ralzeri." The younger matriarch stopped, but her eyes burned with challenge. "You came for truth," the queen said to Jack. "Then you will live among us. Not as a guest, as a watcher, a servant." Jack didn't flinch. "I came to see your world. I'll see it through your eyes." "Good," the queen said. "Then let's see how long your heart lasts." They took his weapons, his gear, even his jacket. Jack was given a simple robe, rough and uncomfortable. He was shown a stone bed inside a quiet, dark chamber. The door locked behind him. Outside, the alien city pulsed with heat and tension. Inside, Jack sat alone, but his mind was awake, watching, waiting. He had just stepped into a world where men were powerless, where trust was poison, where silence was survival. And still, he wasn't afraid. Because Jack wasn't just here to survive. He was here to change everything. The blood trial. He walked into the savage alien matriarch's territory and left them speechless. Morning on Erixonine wasn't peaceful. The skies didn't sing. The sun didn't rise gently. It burned the land alive. The air shimmered like a furnace as Jack stood outside the stone chamber where he had slept, or tried to. The bed had been cold and hard, the air heavy with dust. Still, he hadn't complained. Ralzeri was waiting for him. She was the younger matriarch, the one who wanted to test him, maybe even break him. Her silver markings glowed faintly as the sun hit her skin. She looked down at him with the same hatred in her eyes. "This is your first task," she said. "You will join the blood trial." Jack frowned. "What's the blood trial?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked. He followed. Soon, they entered a wide arena carved into the rocky ground. It was filled with matriarchs, hundreds of them. Warriors, elders, hunters, and even the young, all gathered around, watching. Jack stepped onto the red sand. Across from him stood a creature. Not one of the matriarchs, but something worse. It was a beast with 4 legs, sharp claws, and eyes full of hunger. Its mouth was covered in dried blood. Jack looked at Ralzeri. "You're throwing me into a pit with a monster." She crossed her arms. "You said you wanted to see our world. This is how our males are tested. Fight or die." The crowd roared. Jack's heart pounded. He had no weapons, no armor, just the robe. But he didn't back away. Instead, he stepped forward. The beast snarled and charged. Jack dodged to the side. Fast. The sand shifted under him, nearly tripping him. He rolled, barely avoiding the monster's claws. The matriarchs laughed. Some even cheered for the beast. Jack got up quickly and looked around. No weapons, no rocks, nothing. Just him and death. The beast circled him again. This time, when it leaped, Jack didn't dodge. He ran forward, straight at it. At the last second, he slid under the creature's chest and slammed his elbow into its throat. The beast howled and stumbled. Jack jumped onto its back and wrapped his arm around its neck. He squeezed, holding on like his life depended on it. Because it did. The beast thrashed. Claws tore at the air. Blood dripped from Jack's arm as one claw sliced him. Still, he didn't let go. He gritted his teeth and whispered, "I didn't come here to die. Not today." With one final twist, the beast collapsed. Dead. Silence fell. Then, a slow clap. Ralzeri stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "You didn't fight like a warrior," she said. Jack looked up at her, breathing hard. "I fought like a human." Another voice spoke. The queen. She had been watching from the high seat above the arena. He used his mind, not just his body. Interesting. Ralzeri's jaw tightened, but she said nothing more. Jack stood in the blood-soaked sand. His arm was cut. His robe was torn. But his eyes were clear. He didn't speak to the crowd. He didn't raise his fists. He just stood there, calm, silent, and strong. The matriarchs whispered among themselves. Maybe the human wasn't weak. Maybe he was something else. That night, Jack was returned to his chamber. His arm was wrapped in old bandages. He was given water, but no food. Still, he didn't complain. He sat alone, remembering every detail of the arena, the beast, and the way the crowd had stared at him afterward. He wasn't here to win fights. He was here to win minds. And tomorrow, he knew the real test would begin. A warrior's respect. He walked into the savage alien matriarch's territory and left them speechless. Jack woke up before the sun. The wound on his arm still burned, but he didn't wince. He washed his face with cold water from a cracked basin, then stepped out of his chamber. 2 matriarch guards were waiting. Without a word, they led him through the stone corridors, deeper into the city. The walls were covered in carvings, more battle scenes, victories, and something else. A female lifting her spear over the body of a male warrior. Jack kept his eyes forward. At the end of the hallway, a large metal door opened. Inside was Ralzeri. She stood in the center of a tall chamber lit by fire pits. A long spear was strapped to her back, and her chest plate gleamed like black glass. "This is the Hall of the First Blades," she said coldly. "Only warriors are allowed here." Jack stayed quiet. "I didn't bring you here to train," she continued. "I brought you here to understand." She walked over to a rack filled with weapons. Some were old and worn. Others looked untouched. She picked up a short blade and threw it at Jack's feet. He didn't pick it up. She raised an eyebrow. "Still pretending you're not a fighter?" "I'm not pretending," he said. "I've seen enough killing to last me a lifetime." She stepped closer. "Then you'll never survive here." Jack looked up at her. "I didn't come to survive. I came to break the cycle." Her lips tightened. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she surprised him. She turned and slammed her blade into a wooden dummy. With fast, brutal strikes, she tore it apart, her muscles sharp and precise. It was like watching a dance made of rage. When she stopped, the dummy was nothing but splinters. She turned back to him, breathing hard. "That's how we live. Every day. Every night. Fighting." Jack nodded slowly. "But why? What are you protecting? What are you afraid of?" She flinched, just a little. But Jack saw it. Then, footsteps echoed in the chamber. The queen entered. Jack straightened. Ralzeri stepped back and bowed. But the queen's eyes were locked on Jack. "Tell me, human," she said, "why did you refuse the blade?" Jack looked her in the eye. "Because the moment I take up a weapon, I become part of the problem. You've had enough blood. You don't need more fighters. You need someone to see what you've forgotten." The queen's voice dropped lower. "And what have we forgotten?" Jack took a breath. "Mercy. Peace. The reason why you fought in the first place." The queen studied him. Then, to everyone's shock, she smiled. It was not a soft smile. It was sharp, cautious, almost dangerous. "You speak like a fool," she said, "but a brave one." She turned to Ralzeri. "Train him, not as a soldier, as an equal." Ralzeri's mouth opened slightly, but she didn't argue. The queen left, her steps slow and calm. Ralzeri turned to Jack, eyes filled with fire. "You heard her," she growled. "Don't expect kindness." "I never do," Jack said. That afternoon, the training began. Not with weapons, but with movement, with balance, with breathing. Ralzeri showed him how they fought, how they moved, how they survived. She didn't go easy on him. She knocked him down more than once. But Jack got up every time. No anger, no complaints. Each time, he stood stronger. At the end of the day, she tossed him a cup of water and stared at him. "You're not what I expected." Jack took a sip, then replied, "Neither are you." She didn't smile. But for the first time, she didn't look at him with hate. Just curiosity. And somewhere deep within her warrior heart, a crack had begun to form. Not of weakness, but of change. When walls begin to crack, he walked into the savage alien matriarchs' territory and left them speechless. Days passed. The city of the matriarchs didn't grow quieter. It only grew stranger to Jack. Every day began with training. Ralzeri pushed him harder than any soldier ever had. She struck fast, without warning. She expected pain to teach. Jack never backed down. Bruises covered his arms. His legs ached. His ribs burned from one harsh fall. Still, he stood. He moved differently now, not just with strength, but with awareness. He didn't fight to win. He moved to survive, to understand. Sometimes the other matriarchs stopped to watch. Some whispered. Others just stared. "He still breathes," one of them muttered. "How?" One evening after a long session, Ralzeri stood across from him under the fading sun. Her breathing was heavy. Jack was soaked in sweat. They were silent for a long moment. Then she asked something strange. "Do humans sing after battle?" Jack blinked. "What?" "In our old stories," she said quietly, "the males sang when they won. Some say it was to call the stars. Others say it was to remember the dead." Jack looked up at the darkening sky. "We sing too, but not always when we win." "Why then?" she asked. He shrugged. Sometimes when we're scared, sometimes when we miss someone, sometimes just to feel human again. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said something even stranger. Sing. Jack hesitated. Then softly he did. It wasn't a song of victory. It was a slow, low tune, one his father used to hum when the nights got cold. His voice cracked a little, dry from dust and silence, but the melody was real. Ralzeri didn't speak again. She just listened. That night, Jack was brought to a different chamber. It wasn't a prison. It wasn't a cell. It had a fire pit, a soft rug, and even a carved seat. He sat down slowly, confused. Then the queen entered. Her robes were black tonight, lined with small bones that rattled like wind chimes. She studied him in silence. "You've lasted longer than any other male we've tested," she said. "I didn't come to pass a test," Jack replied. "I came to learn." The queen tilted her head. "Then tell me, what have you learned?" Jack thought for a moment. "You don't fear strength," he said. "You fear betrayal. That's why you control everything. That's why your people follow war so closely. They believe peace invites weakness." A long silence. The queen didn't blink. "You speak as if you know us." Jack shook his head. "I don't. Not yet. But I've seen broken people before. And sometimes they build walls so strong, they forget what it's like to be free." The queen stepped closer. "In our history," she said slowly, "freedom was a lie. It came with promises, and those promises came with chains. We will never kneel again." Jack met her gaze. "Then maybe it's time someone stood beside you, not above, not below." She didn't answer. She only turned and left. But as the heavy door closed behind her, Jack noticed something. It hadn't been locked. The secret beneath the stone. He walked into the savage alien matriarchs' territory and left them speechless. The door wasn't locked. Jack stared at it for a while after the queen left. He didn't move. It wasn't fear holding him back. It was the feeling that something had shifted. The test wasn't just survival anymore. Now, it was trust. The next morning, things felt different. Guards didn't watch him as closely. The other matriarchs no longer glared when he passed. A few even nodded. And Ralzeri. She didn't strike him as hard in training. She corrected his stance once, softly. Her words were still sharp, but there was something else behind them now. Respect. That evening, when the heat faded and the city lights glowed in strange blue patterns, Ralzeri called to him. "Follow me," she said. Jack obeyed without question. They walked deeper into the city, far past the public towers and training fields, past the cages of wild beasts and the arenas of flame. They entered an old temple carved into the side of a black mountain. 2 guards stood at the entrance, but they said nothing. Inside, it was quiet. The walls were covered in symbols older than the matriarch's written language. Jack could feel the weight of history pressing down on his skin. This place was sacred, forgotten. A spiral staircase led them underground. Down, down, and farther down. The air changed. It was colder, thicker. The smell of dust and time filled Jack's nose. Finally, they reached a wide stone chamber. At the center stood a monument. It was simple, a smooth stone pillar, maybe 10 feet tall. Around it were carvings of strange creatures. Not matriarchs, not humans, but something else. Ralzeri spoke for the first time. "This is where it began," she said quietly. "Our oldest truth, our greatest shame." Jack looked at the carvings. "What am I looking at?" She stepped forward and touched the stone. "Long ago, our people were slaves, not to humans, not to machines, but to the ones who made us. They bred us strong, taught us to kill, told us males were weakness, told us love was a chain." Jack's eyes moved across the figures. Tall, shadowy beings stood over smaller matriarchs, forcing them to fight. "They made us forget who we were," she whispered. "They made us afraid of softness, Jack stepped closer. Why show me this now? Ralzeri turned to him, and for the first time, her voice shook. Because you're the first one who didn't try to break us. You didn't raise a weapon. You didn't ask for power. You asked for peace. She paused. We don't know what peace looks like. Jack looked at her. Then maybe it's time to draw it. There was silence. Then, movement. Behind the monument, another door opened. The Queen stepped out. She had heard everything. And this time, she didn't walk like a ruler. She walked like a mother carrying pain. Jack bowed his head, not out of fear, but out of respect. The Queen walked to the pillar and placed her hand beside Ralzeri's. Our past is a wound, she said. But you, human, you may be the first stitch. Jack looked at both of them. Two powerful beings, born of war, shaped by fire. And he realized something. They didn't need a savior. They needed a witness. A reminder that not all strength is made of fists. Some strength is simply standing and listening. The human who changed everything. He walked into the savage alien matriarchs' territory and left them speechless. The news spread like wildfire across the city. The human had been taken to the sacred hall. He had seen the forbidden stone. He had stood beside the Queen and Ralzeri, not as a prisoner, but as something more. The matriarchs were divided. Some called it betrayal. Others called it a sign. But one thing was certain, everything was changing. And no one knew what would happen next. Jack was summoned to the Great Circle, an ancient place where decisions were made, wars declared, and judgments passed. No outsider had ever been allowed there. Now Jack stood in its center. Around him, hundreds of matriarchs sat in tall black seats, their eyes sharp and cold. At the very top sat the Queen, and beside her, Ralzeri stood like a silent blade. The Queen rose. Today, she said, we face a truth we cannot ignore. She looked down at Jack. This human walked into our territory alone. We gave him every reason to fear. We tested him. We bled him. And still, he stayed. Some warriors growled. He fought without hate. He listened without pride. He showed us our past and made us question our future. Murmurs echoed. One elder stood. He is still male, still human. How can we trust him? Jack raised his head. He didn't wait for permission. He spoke. I didn't come here to be trusted. I came to learn. But in learning, I saw something more. He looked around at the fierce, scarred faces watching him. You are strong, but your greatest strength isn't your weapons. It's your will. You survived centuries of chains. You became warriors. But now, you don't have to fight everyone. You don't have to be alone. Silence. Then a voice from the crowd, soft, young, unsure. What do we do if we stop fighting? Jack turned toward it. You begin living. The words were simple, but they hit like thunder. Ralzeri stepped forward. For once, she looked nervous. She took off her blade and laid it on the ground. Gasps filled the air. I choose to live, she said, to lead, with something more than fear. The Queen watched her. Then, slowly, she nodded. One by one, warriors began to rise. Some still clutched weapons. Others dropped them. Some cried. Others stood in silence, but they were changing. And it all began with one human who walked in without a gun, without a crown, and without a lie. That night, a fire was lit in the center of the city, not for war, but for gathering. Jack sat beside Ralzeri. She didn't speak. She just watched the flames. The Queen sat in silence too. Across from them, young warriors listened as elders told stories, not of battles, but of beginnings. And for the first time in many lifetimes, peace didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a choice. Jack looked up at the stars. He had come alone, unarmed, unwanted. But now, he wasn't just the man who entered their world. He was the man who reminded them what it meant to build a new one.